I was hoping that my second video on this channel wasn't going to make me look crazy, but I don't think that the title or the thumbnail of this video has achieved that. I just want to answer the question with a no right out of the gate. I think any attempt to ban obesity, to outlaw obesity, would be immoral, unethical, and quite dubious in whether or not it would actually achieve anything good. So does that mean that the title of this video was clickbait? Yes. But I have a reason for it. And it's because I see this suggested as a response to an argument that I see around helmet laws. So for those of you who don't know, there are actually a decent number of states that do not have a helmet requirement while operating a motorcycle. And because there is no unified federal law requiring helmets, it means that you'll often see helmet law arguments pop up on the internet. Whether it's a YouTube video arguing one way or the other, or an article from Revzilla talking about helmet laws, or whether it's a Reddit thread asking us Americans why we don't have a helmet law, you'll see the same argument play out in the comment sections of each of those locations over and over again. And it's such a common argument that I can basically recite it from memory. It doesn't help that it kind of is something that sends me spiraling every time I see, so it's something I think about quite often. But the bones of the argument go like this. Someone will say, it's wild that we don't have a helmet law, it'll save a lot of lives. Someone will reply to that with, yeah, but listen, it doesn't impact you if I don't wear a helmet, so you shouldn't be able to tell me what to do. Someone will reply to that with, actually, it does impact me because if you get injured, your medical costs are going to cause insurance companies to raise their premiums. And then that's when the bomb gets dropped that leads to the title of this video, which is someone suggesting that because we have now migrated over to reducing insurance costs, that we should ban obesity. I love this argument. I love it because it makes no sense, but it gets thrown out every time. And I'll concede that it does have a few different varieties. Sometimes people don't talk about banning obesity outright. Sometimes they just say that we should reduce people's access to sugary foods, or we need to put a ban on cheeseburgers. But the general argument that if we're going to mandate helmet laws, it also makes sense that we might try to control weight is, in my opinion, a very weird connection. And I think that this argument arises from what is probably the standard American's perception of whether or not something should be illegal, which is what I referenced earlier, which is that my rights should extend so far as to someone else's rights, which is a fancy way of saying you do you, I do me, and we can all live happily together. And I don't have a qualm with that mentality when it's used in people's day-to-day lives. I think it actually will lead to people being quite tolerant of one another. The problem is it's a little too simple of a framework for deciding whether or not a regulation or a law should be put in place. Instead, I would suggest that if you want a really simple way to evaluate whether a law or a regulation might be a good idea, that you should ask three general questions. The first question is, what good are we hoping to achieve with this law? Hopefully, by enacting a law, you're going to achieve some sort of benefit for society. The second and third questions are somewhat intertwined with one another and are usually best answered at the same time. But we can divvy them up just to make it so that we have, three nice, easy questions to remember. The second one is, what burdens are we going to place on the individual or society if we enact these laws? And then the last question is, what is enforcement going to look like? And so I quickly want to take a look at the idea of enacting a helmet law and the idea that we might ban obesity somehow, and just look at these potential laws through the lens of those three questions. Let's do obesity first because I think it's the more psychotic of the two, and on YouTube, obviously I want to retain your eyeballs for as long as possible. So first and foremost, the amount of good that could be achieved through this law is going to be highly dependent on how well you can write the law to actually achieve the outcome. We all know that just because you make something illegal doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to achieve that result. There's plenty of ways in which laws don't achieve their intended goal. But in theory, right, the idea is that if people are all a healthy weight, they're going to have a better quality of life and better health outcomes, and they're going to be less of a drain on the health industry as a whole. Like I said, I do think it's, and I just want to preface this, like I think that is a very dubious goal to try to achieve in general, but that is the framework, right, through which we're looking at this law. The second question, right, is what kind of burdens are we going to be placing on society? Requiring everyone to maintain a healthy weight is quite burdensome for the individual. Not everyone is particularly concerned about that. Now they're going to have to be focused on it. People might be investing money in personal trainers, in gym memberships, in healthier food options. They might be investing more time in exercise and cooking. And you might argue that those are good things. Fine. I would say still that they represent burdens and they need to be listed as such. But I think that the biggest hurdles come with enforcement, right? How do you enforce a ban on obesity? Well, first you probably have to pick a metric by which you're going to judge someone. One of the more common ways to judge someone's weight is BMI, but that's horrifically inaccurate in a lot of regards. It might be a quick, good judge of very broad things, right? But it's going to cause significant problems for most athletes who carry a fair bit of muscle for their frame. Offensive linemen, just as a position, destroyed, gone, right? So football is going to take a big hit and we cannot have that. But even if you use something more advanced than BMI, like body fat percentages, well, who's going to be calculating this? Are we requiring a bunch of people to go to the doctor every 6 months? Because add that into the burden category if that's going to be part of enforcement. And who's paying for that, right? That's going to be kind of tough. And then what do the punishments look like? I mean, are we fining people? Are we forcing them to go to the gym? And who's paying for that? And fines are kind of expensive and not particularly economically efficient. And then are we creating a weird perverse system where people who are overweight end up staying home because they're afraid of being harassed by the police? And that's not good, right? Because we want people outside exercising and enjoying their lives. So lots of bad things here. Obviously, this is probably not going to be good for people with eating disorders or disabilities or just different genetics. And there are so many different variables, right? So a nightmare on the enforcement side of things. And you might have an answer for every single one of those questions. And that's awesome. Good for you. You should be a legislator. But I'm just really kind of trying to point out here that it's an immensely complicated question. I think it's going to be a nice contrast to our next discussion, right? Which is, what does a potential helmet law look like? Well, first, what's the benefit, right? We're hopefully saving some people's lives. We know for a fact that by repealing the helmet law that we've actually cost a lot of lives. And so the inverse is true, right? If we enacted a helmet law, we would save a decent number of lives. And I think that there's some intrinsic good to that on its own, outside of any kind of potential medical bill savings. But let's get to the next two topics, because those are more important, I would say, for comparing and contrasting these two laws. What does the burden for a helmet law look like on society? Well, we have to now account for the fact that anyone who rides a motorcycle is going to lose some of their personal choice. And in addition, they're going to have to purchase or acquire a helmet of some sort. We're going to have to probably enact some sort of helmet standard, and we might want to keep it up to date. And we're going to have stores that sell these helmets, all that kind of stuff. There is a burden on the individual and the society that comes with it, but not particularly substantial, right? There's plenty of places that have helmet laws, including the state that I live in, and it's one of the most popular places to ride a motorcycle still. So I would say that it's not so burdensome that it destroys the industry or anything like that. And then the next category is enforcement. Well, we already have highway patrol in most states, and this is just another code that they could cite someone for. You could have a relatively small fine or maybe report it to insurance companies, but it's not that complicated to think of the ways that you might enforce a helmet law. And it's pretty easy for people to see, right, if someone's wearing a helmet or not. Obviously, some people wear novelty helmets to get around the helmet law, but if someone is that determined to get around the law, it's not that big a deal. At a minimum, there's going to be a lot more people wearing DOT or ECE helmets than there otherwise would be without the law. So let's very quickly summarize the answer to the three questions for each law. For obesity, the goal is a healthier weight for the population. That's the benefit. The burdens are pretty significant, right? Especially depending on what enforcement mechanism you pick, and the enforcement mechanism is extremely complicated and going to be quite difficult to enact. With helmet laws, the good is, again, hopefully improving people's health and or maintaining additional people's lives. and it is relatively low in terms of burden, right? Helmets are not crazy expensive. You can get very nice ones for less than $200. And the enforcement is not that difficult. There's plenty of states that are, I mean, spoiler alert, there's a lot of states that have helmet laws, and it's not that difficult to enforce it. And so that's why I find that argument so mind-boggling when I see it in the same sequence over and over again, with someone saying helmet laws save lives. You can't tell me what to do. Actually, I can tell you what to do because this impacts me through health insurance. And then fine, but if that's your stance, then we need to ban fat people. It's just such an interesting sequence of arguments that just keep coming up. And I haven't really seen someone break down why it makes almost no sense to compare those two things to one another, other than to show why you probably shouldn't be comparing those two. Now, I want to take a second to address some of the stuff that I know is going to be in the comment section. I tried to do a better job of front loading the stuff in this video instead of spending a bunch of time talking about why I'm talking about what I'm talking about. I tried to get into the meat and potatoes a bit quicker, but that means I know there's going to be a lot of stuff in the comment section that I would like to address in video form so that I can just like timestamp responses. And the first is going to be the slippery slope argument. That's probably the most common substitute for we should ban obesity, is that, well, if we enact a helmet law and we acknowledge that motorcycles are dangerous, then someone's gonna come along and ban motorcycles as a whole. But this is just another one of those situations that I think that if you answer the 3 questions about the banning of motorcycles, you'll see why it's in an entirely different category than the mandate of helmets. So let's do that real quick for a proposed ban on all motorcycles. Well, obviously there's going to be less motorcycle crashes. That's the main goal, right? And fewer motorcycle fatalities, but you're going to end up with an entire industry gone, right? An entire industry gone, right? All those jobs just destroyed. You're completely removing a hobby. You're impacting society much more dramatically than you would be if you were just requiring people wear a helmet. And there's a reason that this is called a slippery slope fallacy. It's not always going to be completely useless, right? But in most regards, the idea that something represents a slippery slope, it's just not accurate. Almost all laws are some arbitrary line drawn somewhere between personal freedom and something that benefits society to have outlawed. And so the reality is that when people go, well, where are we going to draw the line? The answer is somewhere. We're going to draw the line somewhere. And we're going to hopefully be asking even more complicated questions than the 3 I've proposed as the bare minimum for questions you might ask before you mandate something. The answer ultimately to the slippery slope argument is we're going to draw a line somewhere, and hopefully we're going to be able to pick something that we kind of all agree makes the most sense. And another thing I know I'm going to see in the comment section is that you don't have to try to outlaw obesity. You could target things like cheeseburgers or things like sugary drinks, right? And that we have done that for certain things, right? We restrict at what age people are able to consume alcohol. We have outlawed certain drugs. And yeah, I agree. Those are all things that I think kind of are on my side of the argument, that it's relatively easy to enforce some of these things. And, you know, we can decide not to sell sugary drinks in schools, and we can decide not to sell alcohol to minors, but that an outright ban is much more dramatic. And another thing I want to address is specifically the earlier argument, the second argument, the one that says, well, you shouldn't be able to tell me what to do if it doesn't impact you. And I just want to say that there are very few things that people do in society that don't impact other members of society, and oftentimes in ways that you might not really think. For the most part, society has invested in almost all of its members. There are very few people who truly live 100% off the grid, and that means that the rest of us have most likely a public education. And even if we have a private education, it was probably paid for by your parents, who likely have customers that have a public education and can only afford to shop at your parents' business or whatever because they have money that they were able to earn because they know how to read and write, and they know how to think critically, and they know how to do math and these kinds of important things that you get from public education. And if you decide to squander that education over a helmet, that's upsetting to members of society. So there's past investment, but there's an opportunity cost to letting your society members not wear a helmet. I know some people will be like, well, this is just the Darwin Award, right? People are just self-selecting. If you're not wearing a helmet, you had nothing worth protecting anyways. And I don't agree with that. There are a lot of people who are actually quite intelligent in a whole variety of different ways, but end up making dumb decisions. I'm not saying I'm intelligent, but I can guarantee you that I'm able to hold a stable and somewhat productive job for society while also making lots of really dumb decisions in my life. So this idea that only dumb people do dumb things is just not true, right? Smart people do plenty of dumb things too, and sometimes people do need to be protected from themselves at least a little bit, especially when that protection from themselves isn't a big burden on society. Another way that it impacts people is it's somewhat similar to the insurance side of things, but legally, by not mandating helmets, you create this gray area that is actually quite problematic for the legal system. Luckily, I am the complete underachiever in my family, so I was able to get some legal help from my sister and my brother-in-law in terms of things I might want to look at for this video. And they directed me to a particular page, right, that kind of went through a series of legal cases where, because of an absence of a helmet law, you could argue in a civil case that someone's injuries were in part due to their decision to not wear a helmet, and that meant that you shouldn't have to pay out as much for the damages related to their injuries because they didn't take reasonable self-preservation steps. And this means that, in simplest terms, you're hiring expert witnesses to argue that someone's injuries are due to them not wearing a helmet, or at least in part due to that, because it's not always 100% win, 100% lose in court cases. Oftentimes it's like you're found partially at fault depending on the state you're in. And you're paying additional legal fees. And all because we've decided that we really need to protect someone's personal decision to not wear a helmet. Ultimately, I also wanted to state what side I'm on and why. I am on the side of helmet laws being good. I think that in general, there's a lot of good that comes from making this hobby safer, right? It's going to discourage less people from becoming new riders, which I think is really important to the survival of the motorcycle industry as a whole. I think it destigmatizes the riding community a little bit. And I think that there's just an intrinsic good in saving some lives. And while I do totally sympathize with the idea that personal choice should be protected, we should minimize the times in which society steps in and dictates what people can or cannot do, I also have to acknowledge that as a society that we have a responsibility to one another, especially with regards to things that are not rights. Riding a motorcycle on the road is not a right, it's a privilege, and that's why it can be taken away from us. I hope that you found this video somewhat thought-provoking, even if you're not into motorcycles, and hopefully it gives you a new perspective on how to look at regulations, you know, the very exciting things that dominates our lives. Let me down in the comment section what you think of helmet laws. Has this done nothing to sway you? Are you still 100% for personal choice in this regard? Or has it made you rethink a little bit the idea of a helmet law? Because that's all I can really hope for. I don't think I'm gonna change anyone's mind 100% one way or the other, but hopefully at a minimum you've got a better understanding of where people who do support a helmet law are coming from if you're someone who's opposed to one. Anyways, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next video.